Matapang din si Marcolita. Magandang gabi po. Habang naghihintay tayo ng pangatlong yugto ng confirmation hearing, confirmation charges hearing, ay uulitin muna natin, bigyan natin ng tutok itong yung talumpati ni Attorney Kaufman kanina parang bilang kanyang pagdepensa laban sa mga akusasyon ng prosecution na si Deputy Prosecutor Binjaye at saka si Joel Butuyan na walang ginagawang kwento, puro walang laman. Kagaya ng lata, ang ingay ng lata kapag walang lamang gatas, pag pinagulong mo, puro ingay lamang. Ito kay Kaufman, binisto sila ni Kaufman. Kaya atin ngayon, ipakita na ulitin natin yung sinabi ni Kaufman kasi pinutol-putol ako kanina. Ito. Dito tayo kay Kaufman.
Mr. Kaufman, please.
And I thank Mr. Butuyan for his intervention, but I feel that I ought to remind him that this is a court of law which decides matters on the basis of evidence, not on the basis of political demagoguery.
Ay, nako. Hello, I'm back. Mahirap pagkalaban ka ng administrasyon. Ito po ang nangyayari sa akin. Magla-live ka lang naman, inaatake pa ng DICT. Naku naman talaga itong mga kwa na to. Pagkalaban ka, nangyayari, lagi nangyayari sa akin ito eh. Yung ibang vlogger hindi naman ginagawa ng ganito.
Counsel Butuyan. Now over to the defense. Mr. Kaufman, please.
And I thank Mr. Butuyan for his intervention.
Mr.
But I feel that I ought to remind him that this is a court of law which decides matters on the basis of evidence, not on the basis of political demagoguery, and not on the basis of a desire to effect regime change despite the democratic will. And certainly not on the basis of statements made by Ombudsman Jesus Crispin Remulla, who professed that domestic justice will be denied, according to Mr. Butuyan, because of the lack of forensic reports and police reports. Now, I don't know which case Mr. Butuyan's metaphorical ship sailed into, but he clearly hasn't read the evidence. Whilst he was speaking, we examined the evidence, and out of that evidence, we found at least 35 reports substantiating 49 of the incidents which are mentioned in a document containing the charges. Your Honours, Rodrigo Duterte was and will always remain a unique phenomenon. His style of statesmanship was novel and unpalatable to many. His expletives and hyperbole grated, while his honesty and wild popularity irritated. He spoke openly, from the heart, sincerely and truthfully. And what a contrast between him and his successor in the Malacanang. For President Rudy, his word was his word, and the people knew it. For President Bong Bong, his word is for the wind, and the people will not forget it. Let me remind everyone of the letter which President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. signed, it's on the screen, and in which he gave a cast-iron undertaking that his government, and I quote, will not assist the ICC in any way, shape, or form.
Ayan binabanggit niyang hindi na siya mag-assist. Pero ngayon, pati mga pamilya ng victims, binibigyan ng gobyerno ng pera pamasahe sa ICC. Kada isang tao, tandaan mo halos 200,000 ang gastos ng eroplano papunta doon. Isang tao lang. Pabalik, 200,000. Saan kukuha ng kalahating milyon bawat isa dyan? Hindi gobyerno.
Well, as we know,
ang ibig sabihin, talaga may effort sila gibain na Duterte. Yan na lang ang mission, kaya sa susunod, palabasan ng mga warrant of arrest si Sara Duterte. Oras na mangyari yan, wala kay mga masisira na talaga Duterte. Ako na to, BBM.
Keep that promise. Rodrigo Duterte was unconstitutional and unceremoniously hauled off to The Hague. And when called upon to defend his master's actions and the said letter at a Senate committee hearing, the then Secretary for Justice, once again Mr. Jesus Crispin Remulla, persisted with the same dishonest theme. And I quote his words, "We did not assist the ICC. We continue with the very tenor of the letter that we did not assist the ICC and we did not have any contact with them." So he said, but with a document emanating from the prosecution team opposite and disclosed to us a mere week ago, not as information material to the preparation of our defense, but as exonerating evidence, we can now substantiate what we have suspected for a long time. The document comprises a transcript of a telephone call covertly recorded between 4 parties who cannot be mentioned in public, and one of these parties was boasting about how he was acting as the silent partner of President BBM, managing a scheme to funnel witnesses to this court while all the time ensuring that he could guarantee President BBM's plausible deniability.
Sino yung kipakutsaba kay BBM?
So it is indeed the defense case
Ay,
that
di ko
President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. set out to neutralize
Sino yun?
Rodrigo Duterte and his legacy.
Bakit
Yes,
tayo
Mr.
bibigyan?
Deputy Prosecutor, I used that legendary word, neutralize,
Trillanes.
so central and so essential to your case theory, because you know just as well as me that I'm using the term metaphorically. And now I turn to the substance of the charges, but before I do,
Trillanes, oh.
a word or two about the geopolitical context. The scourge of illegal narcotics is not unique to the Philippines. As we all know, it afflicts Latin America, where I can name 3 countries where the death rate at the hands of vigilantes and law enforcement agents per capita population is higher than it ever was under Duterte. And as you should know, and you will hear from the prosecution, at any rate, the Philippines as a country is uniquely positioned to act as a transit hub for the trafficking of narcotics emanating from the cartels in China. And with or without Duterte, so we argue, the death rate would have kept on rising. Indeed, as we will prove with statistics and reports, the death rate flowing from narcotics-related crime actually increased after Rodrigo Duterte left power. And where, I ask you, has the International Criminal Court been started that Rodrigo did anything? The totally lawful Duterte campaign against illegal drugs and their suppliers took place when his administration was after the declaration of martial law. And it was on that significant day that Rodrigo Duterte was exposed to the tyranny of oppression and the abuse of power by the elite. And he took a decision. On that day, he chose to devote himself to a life of selfless public service. As a professor at the local police academy and as a public prosecutor in Davao, Rodrigo Duterte developed a lifelong passion, some would say an enduring obsession, for law and order, something for which he unapologetically enforced throughout his time as mayor of Davao City. Not, as the prosecution say, through sowing murder and mayhem, but through winning the love, respect, and admiration of his fellow citizens, the very same citizens who continued to re-elect him time after time, term after term, on no less than 7 occasions over more than 2 decades. And throughout his 20 or so years tenure as the mayor of Davao, Rodrigo Duterte and his family transformed that city from an outpost of communist insurgency and criminal violence into what is now one of the safest cities, not just in the Philippines, but in the entire world. This was indeed the so-called Davao model, which the prosecution wants to persuade you was code for unbridled criminal violence. And this was the type of leader that the Filipino nation wanted in 2016. So, Rodrigo Duterte was elected into power, not in spite of, but specifically because of his firm and uncompromising commitment to upholding law and order. And after his election as president, Rodrigo Duterte remained a man of the people without seeking to patronize the people. Gung-ho in his ways and with a belligerent tone, he spoke the tough tongue of the street, not the dissembling discourse of international diplomacy. He said what the people wanted to hear, but he said it in a way that offended sensibilities of world leaders unaccustomed to hearing it, one in particular, and that was what set him on the slippery slope to a prison cell in The Hague. And let me tell you how it works. It starts with the media, controlled by the powerful and the politically influential. With a sensational headline and a twisted editorial slant, the moguls sell their papers while promoting the partisan agenda of their backers in power. They highlight the salacious content while ignoring the true context, because that is what captivates the reader. And so it was with Rodrigo Duterte, whose speeches were fertile fodder for his enemies and detractors. A man whose hyperbole, bluster, and rhetoric, once published, became a natural target for privately funded NGOs and human rights activists, a loose collective more commonly known as civil society. These people descended upon the Philippines to advance an agenda even more lacking in objectivity than that of the media, and heavily funded by tycoons with even grander designs, they print their glossy reports, replete with iconic photographic images of grieving families and dead bodies in rain-swept, nighttime crime scenes, all dramatically illuminated with the fluorescent glow of neon. Images carefully crafted to shock the conscience and to sway the emotions, and, I may say, to be used by the prosecutor when they don't even relate to the charges. And they gave their slick reports bold titles lifted straight out of a James Bond movie, such as License to Kill,
James Bond movie lang.
One Shot to the Head, You Can Die Anytime, or simply, They Just Kill. The photographers are fated and their shots exhibited as art all over the world, and the brave journalists who act as their sources win awards and Nobel Prizes. And slowly but surely, their narrative becomes the sacred, unchallengeable, and unshakable truth. And so the pressure builds up, and the academics who haunt the corridors of the progressive left law faculties far away in the United States tweet their research and publish their articles pontificating about crimes against humanity, systematic attacks against the civilian population, and they point their finger at one man alone, and bandy about slogans such as accountability and the prevention of impunity. They give their gratuitous advice on what should be done, sometimes academics who formerly worked alongside the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Communications and complaints are filed, and the rest, as they say, is history. In any event, we're not gathered here today to judge a man on the basis of his coarse attitude or his vulgar language. This court has convened a confirmation hearing to verify whether substantial grounds exist to believe that Rodrigo Duterte, the people's president, together with various so-called co-perpetrators, over the years of his governance, devised a criminal policy of wholesale and wanton murder. And since we are in a court of law, it is worth stressing, although I should not have to, cases are decided on the basis of evidence, not supposition, not rumor, not spicy gossip, and certainly not on the basis of political rhetoric and bluster. Because at the end of the day, were it not for those belligerent and controversial speeches, there would have been no impetus to bring the people's president to The Hague. And when the prosecution's evidence is examined, I would ask you to keep an open mind and to question not just whether that evidence has been selectively presented, but whether there exists evidence which the prosecution has failed to produce. And I say this with justifiable cause, particularly with respect to the Duterte rhetoric. As we will prove during the substantive part of our submissions, the notorious speeches on which the prosecution relies have been cherry-picked to suit its narrative while ignoring the many other speeches when the former president tempered his bombastic language by clear reference to the principle of lawful self-defense. We, the defense, have read as many of these speeches as we can find. In fact, in our poky little office on the top floor of the furthest building away in this complex, we have a counter which ticks and ticks. And whenever we come across a speech which contradicts the prosecution's murder theory by reference to self-defense, we give a cheer, and the counter goes up once more, and we celebrate one more nail in the coffin of the prosecution's case theory. As the statistics stand as of today, in contrast to the 20 speeches on which the prosecution relies to prove incitement to kill, we have found 35 more which say the complete opposite. Let me give you 2 examples from the very speeches that the deputy prosecutor himself cited today. Let's refer first of all
Yan ah.
to the famous
Ipakita kayo
PFR
ng
speech,
ebidensya
which the
na
deputy
si Duterte
prosecutor
hindi
referred to.
nagpautos na pumatay.
So this is what the deputy
Binardingan yung mga
prosecutor said.
pulis.
Those of you who are still
Ayaw
sober,
gumawa,
those who haven't
pakikita
tried
yan.
illegal drugs, if you don't want to die or get hurt, don't rely on the priests, including human rights advocates. They won't be able to prevent deaths, and so it goes on. But if we look further on in the very same speech, something which maybe the deputy prosecutor didn't do,
Sabi niya,
this is what he had to say.
Ah.
To our police officers and other officials, do your job, and you will have the unwavering support of the office of the president. I will be with you all the way. Abuse your authority, and there will be hell to pay, for you will have become worse than criminality itself. Well, there you are. You have it straight in your face. Pexo, exonerating evidence within what is claimed to be the prosecution incriminating evidence. I won't take up my time by showing you the second speech, but there is one. If I have time at the end, I will show it to you. So if you add to that another 10 speeches out of the 20 speeches on which the prosecution rely in its document containing the charges, after all, we are in a court of law and we rely on evidence. And what is the evidence that's produced of these speeches? 20 of them. 10 of them, I submit, and we will show this in the substantive part of our submissions, contain exonerating evidence which support the defense case theory. In other words, if you add the 10, which we've identified in the prosecution's 20, to our total of 35, we come to 45 speeches versus 10, which we say support the use of force only in self-defense. That is 350% more speeches in favor of our defense.
sabihin, sinasabi ni KAUFMAN na pinipresenta ng prosecution na ebidensya para patunayan na nag-uutos si Duterte na pumatay ay 10 speech. Pero ang speech na hawak nila ni KAUFMAN para patunayan na pinapagalitan niya, minawarningan yung mga pulis ay 35. So 350% na mas marami ng di hamak ang ebidensya na pabor kay Duterte para patunayan na hindi siya nag-utos sa mga pulis na pumatay.
And 354% more reasons not to confirm the charges. And you can bet your bottom dollar that at the end of today's proceedings, either the victim's self-styled legal assistant to ICC counsel or a prosecution intern will be tasked with scouring the web, looking for the means to prove KAUFMAN wrong. And I will declare it, and I'll declare it loudly and clearly, as if the prosecution didn't know it already. It's not enough to state that since the former president made those extremely inflammatory statements and deaths occurred, that he must, as a matter of course, be criminally responsible for those fatalities. At this stage of the proceedings, the prosecution needs to show substantial grounds to believe that the former president actually desired and foresaw that people would be killed as a result of his incendiary language. For the prosecution to assert that Rodrigo Duterte hoped for deaths to occur or was recklessly indifferent as to whether deaths would occur, which he was not, that's insufficient. So once more for the record, Rodrigo Duterte's language was aimed not at suspected drug pushers as the prosecution would have it, but directly at those poisoning society with their substances, and not, I stress, with lethal intent. His rhetoric was calculated to arouse fear and obedience,
O, kung
to
sino
instill
manakot,
fear in their hearts,
at ang
and to
panakot hindi
inculcate
papapatay.
a respect for the law in their minds. Nothing more,
Tinatakot sila para hindi
nothing
na
less.
ng droga.
That was his intent, and it was not criminal. And as many of these drug pushers demanded to enter prison, I remember seeing the images on the television, lining up to surrender and to enter prison. Now, I challenge my colleagues opposite to prove otherwise, because as we all know, in a criminal process, the burden of proof is on the prosecution. They brought this case and they need to prove it. Rodrigo Duterte need not convince the world of anything, and that is to his fortunate advantage given his current medical condition. He stands behind his legacy resolutely, and he maintains his innocence absolutely. Now, I turn to the general fairness and objectivity of the investigation, which, as we all know, is meant to be an impartial evidence-gathering exercise. As an ex-prosecutor myself, I'm used to investigating agencies pursuing all reasonable lines of inquiry, assimilating all testimonies, and digesting all documentation and forensic evidence, recommending who to target for prosecution, but not so with this prosecution. When we, the defense, study the course of the investigation in this case, one thing is plain as a pikestaff. The chief prosecutor of this court, Mr. Karim Khan, not only failed miserably to carry out his duties under the Rome Statute, requiring him to examine exonerating circumstances as well as incriminating, but he single-handedly contaminated it, so we alleged, by pursuing a one-track crusade with a view to a predetermined objective. Let me explain. Although the ICC officially authorized an investigation into the so-called Philippines situation in late 2021, it was deferred a few months later back to the Philippines for the official investigation to resume only in late 2023. But the real meat of the investigation into count one, relating to the activities of that fictitious construct, the Davao Death Squad, had effectively started way before then, with the sole objective of nailing Rodrigo Duterte. Indeed, all the way back in 2018, during its so-called preliminary examination, the prosecution had an individual who will be referred to as P1 handed to them on a silver platter. This P1 had been interviewed at an earlier date by none other than Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan in his former capacity as a private lawyer and the self-professed legal.
Ito naputol kanina, oh. So anyway, yung nakita nyo, very clear. Very clear na wala pala silang ebidensya. Very clear na nagkikwento lamang sila. Very clear naman sa akin na binabanggit ni Attorney Kaufman ang mga linya na nagsasabi ang lahat na ginagawa nila, pinapakita nila sa madla, sa mundo, na si Duterte ay killer sa pamamagitan ng paggamit ng mga linya na ginagamit sa mga James Bond movie. Die another day. Ano pa mag-iba? The world is not enough. Ano pa mag-iba? Ano pa binamag? So ngayon, yan po ang katotohanan. Pinakita pa ni Kaufman. Sabi niya kanina, hindi mo wala sa isipan ko kanina, ang ginagawa ng mga prosecutor ay magpapakita ng mga speech ni Duterte sa television, sa YouTube, sa mga Facebook, sa anong account. At ang nahango nila ay 10 speeches na nagsasabi na si Duterte ay nag-utos magpapatay. Pero kami naman, may nakuha rin kami sa kanilang ebidensya rin na tinatago pala nila. Ebidensya nila na papakita na 35 na speech ni Duterte nagsasabi na may warning sa mga pulis. Kung mag-abuso kayo, merong kayong
Rodrigo Duterte's role as the mobster-in-chief. The same.
Yan. Gusto din niya palabasin na si Duterte ay mobster-in-chief, hindi siya commander-in-chief. Hindi mobster-in-chief. Biro mo. So, lumalabas na bisto sila lahat ni Kaufman. So, umpisa pa lang. Lumalabas na wala silang ebidensya. Kundi para YouTube lamang. Ang ibang ebidensya nila, yung testimonya na Matabato, tsaka ni Las Cañas, at tsaka ni Rowena Garma, pero ang testimonya ay testimonya, hindi po yan sapat para sabihin proof beyond reasonable doubt. Kailangan ng mga testimonya ay parisan mo ng mga dokumento para mapapaniwalaan. Remember, ito po ay kaso ng murder, basically. Hindi po ito kaso ng rape. Bakit ko nabanggit yan? Ito, mag-aral kayo sa akin patungkol sa batas ng ebidensya. Kung kaso ng rape ang pag-usapan, kahit testimonya lang ng ni-rape ay sapat na para makonvict ang rapist. Bakit? Ang taas ng bigat na binibigay ng batas ng ebidensya sa mga biktima ng rape. Dahil po, yung mga babae na nabiktima ng rape ay kakahiya-hiya po yan sa publiko. At kung napipilitan ito lumabas, wala nang ibang pakayan, kundi katarugan lamang. At kahit na katarugan ang kanyang adhikain, kahit na mahihiya pa siya hanggang gamundo, bali wala sa kanya mailabas lamang kung ano ang katotohanan para makakuha ng katarungan. So yan po.
Her preparation. And what was this information with which Karim Khan had helpfully provided her? A book on which the prosecution relies as evidence. A trashy, scurrilous item of pulp fiction entitled Duterte Harry. Your Honours, the picture on the front cover of that book says it all. It really does scream objectivity, doesn't it? I say that sarcastically, of course. Fortunately for us, the defence, the appeals chamber, has now disqualified Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan from this case. A welcome development as a matter of ethical propriety, but in our opinion, too late in the day to salvage the integrity of the investigation that he had supervised. An investigation in the course of which he concealed his former role as the victim's counsel, who had deemed our client a suspected murderer as far back as 2018 and right up to the very day before this pre-trial chamber issued its arrest warrant. Your Honours, over the next few days, we hope to convince you of the wholly insufficient nature of the evidence against Rodrigo Duterte. We will show you that the paltry number of speeches on which the prosecution rely do not manifest criminal intent. We will also convince you that as hard as they tried, the prosecution's investigators couldn't get even one of its criminal cooperating witnesses, whose reliability is next to zero, to admit that they heard the former president, Rodrigo Duterte, give an order to kill at any time relevant to the charges, or with respect to any of the incidents. And we hope that when you conclude your deliberations, Your Honours, that you will dismiss these grievously misplaced and politically motivated charges. We will ask you to send Rodrigo Duterte back to his family, and we will ask you to give back to the Filipino people their tatay digong. Thank you, Your Honours.
Yun. Very clear.
Presiding Judge, thank you very much, Mr. Kaufman. We shall now suspend. This is the end of initial...
Kaya hanggang dyan lang tayo kasi mag-i-eri pa tayo mamaya. So very clear, pinasin ko lang uli ito para magiging klaro sa lahat na klaro na po na nag-imbento lang ng ebidensya ang kalaban natin. Tanim ebidensya lamang sila. Sabi nila, ang binasihan nila lumalabas ay yung mga speech ni Duterte sa telebisyon, sa YouTube. Sabi ni Kaufman, lahat ng mga speech nila ay 10 lamang na nagsasabi na pwede mong sabihin na nag-utos si Duterte sa mga pulis na pumatay kayo ng mga adik. Pero, meron kaming 35 na speech nagsasabi, hoy mga pulis ka, gawin yung trabaho nyo. At kung oras na inabusin ninyo, mapupunta kayo sa impyerno. Ibig sabihin, hindi po niya tinotolerate ang mga pulis. Tapos na. Yan pa lang. acquitted na. Yun pa lang, kahit hindi ko natitingnan ibang ebidensya, acquitted na. Kasi mawawala na ngayon ng elemento na nag-uutos siya na pumatay. Yun lang namang ang kakabit sa kanya. Nag-utos ka ba pumatay? Kung walang ebidensya, maaring nag-utos. Kaya ang problema natin ay walang ebidensya. Ang problema lang kasi ng umaako sa Benmar Huerte, kamag-anak ni Gregorio del Huerte del Pilar, ay sinasabi nila na si Duterte, iyan ang pinakasusi ng kanilang akusasyon. Kasi iba patunayan nila na maraming namatay. Given na yan. So para mapindam na si Duterte ang nag-utos. Kilala ba ni Duterte lahat ng pulis? Yan ang gusto na palabasin. Na si Duterte nag-utos. At gusto na palabasin, kaya ang pag-utos ay sinusunod ng mga pulis. At ang pag-utos din ay dinadaan sa pamamagitan ng pag-speech. Pero binilang nila ni KAUFMAN ang ebidensya na sinumiti ng prosecution, ang speeches ay 10 lamang. At binilang din ni KAUFMAN ang kanilang ebidensya ng mga speeches na nagsasabi, pag umabuso kayo mga pulis, kayo punyeta, kayo mapupunta kayo sa impyerno. 35. Ibig sabihin, 350% na higit na mas marami ang ebidensya na magsasabi na pinapagalitan niya, winawarningan yung mga pulis na huwag kayo mag-abuso. Ha? So, ibig sabihin, alam na ninyo, very, very weak talagang ebidensya ninyo. So, paano ba ngayon yan? Ano ko na po, nakikita ko na Benmar Huerte. Pagtatapos itong prosesong ito, confirmation of charges, makakauwi na si Digong Duterte at hindi na pag-usapan kung may jurisdiction o wala. Kasi walang ebidensya eh. Ganun na mangyayari. Okay? So hanggang dyan lang muna tayo. Babalik mo tayo mamaya at ilabas natin po ang part 3